January 31st, 1945, Clark Air Base, Luzon, Philippines. Major Frank T. McCoy's hands quivered slightly as he took photos of the aircraft before him. A fully intact Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber with tail number 763-12. This couldn't be a standard design. No Air Force would construct bombers in such a way. Its fuselage gleamed under the tropical sun, its unique cylindrical form earning its allied nickname. Measuring almost 20 meters from nose to tail, the bomber rested on its tricycle landing gear like a massive cigar laid upon the runway. The 25-meter wingspan showed no trace of battle scars. Its two 14-cylinder radial engines, each producing 1,500 horsepower, appeared undamaged. This wasn't wreckage recovered from a crash. It was a fully functional bomber, abandoned intact during the American advance. What seized McCoy's full attention, what would transform America's understanding of Japanese aircraft design, was what he found when he climbed into the wings through the access panels. The fuel tanks were entirely unprotected. No self-sealing rubber layers, no armor plates, no fire suppression systems, no protective coating of any sort. Just thin aluminum skin, barely 2 millimeters thick, separating thousands of liters of high-octane fuel from enemy gunfire. Major McCoy, commander of the Technical Air Intelligence Unit in the Southwest Pacific, had inspected dozens of crashed Japanese planes across the theater. But nothing had prepared him for this. This bomber, left behind intact during the liberation of Clark Field, revealed a design philosophy so foreign to Western military logic that analysts would spend months grasping its meaning. The calculations born from this discovery would reshape U.S. tactical doctrine and aircraft engineering for the rest of the war. Every belief American pilots held about their opponents, about what Japanese engineers would sacrifice for performance, about how little the imperial forces valued crew survival, was about to be shattered by the evidence within this one pristine example of Japan's most vital bomber. The path to this revelation had begun 4 years earlier, on December 8, 1941. That morning, as smoke still drifted above Pearl Harbor, 82 G4M and 26 G3M bombers took off from Formosa. Their target, Clark Field, the main U.S. air base in the Philippines. The strike achieved total surprise. Arriving at 12:35 p.m., the Japanese formation flew at 20,000 feet, safely above American anti-aircraft fire. 27 bombers from the lead wave dropped 636 bombs across Clark Field's runways and facilities. Moments later, Zero fighters swept in at treetop height, their guns tearing apart every aircraft that had survived. Of the 17 B-17 flying fortresses on the ground, 12 were destroyed outright. Nearly all P-40 Warhawk fighters were reduced to burning wrecks. In just 45 minutes, American air power in the Philippines was wiped out. Lieutenant James Harrington, one of the few survivors, watched from a bomb shelter as the Japanese withdrew northward. What struck me most was their approach. He later wrote, "Perfect formation, high altitude, completely beyond our reach. Then their fighters dropped low and ripped us apart. Not a single American plane could take off. The Betty bombers left untouched. The few fighters that managed to launch arrived too late, meeting only empty sky. The Japanese had proven their bombers' incredible range, striking from bases 1,160 kilometers away, a feat no U.S. bomber could then equal. The Betty's first year in combat proved devastatingly effective. On December 10, 1941, just 2 days after the Clark Field attack, 26 G4M bombers joined older G3M Nell aircraft in an assault on Force Z, a British naval group built around the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse. The attack began around 12:20 p.m. Japanese bombers approached in organized waves, their torpedo runs executed with precision that stunned British observers. The Bettys carried Type 91 aerial torpedoes, each weighing 840 kilograms with a 205-kilogram warhead, specifically engineered for shallow water strikes capable of hitting ships even near the coast. The torpedo strikes concentrated on the two capital ships with devastating precision. Prince of Wales, a 43,000-ton battleship representing the peak of modern British naval design, absorbed at least 6 torpedo hits, along with several bomb impacts. The underwater detonations tore open vast breaches in the hull, flooding compartments faster than damage control crews could respond. The battleship began to list heavily. Repulse, a World War I-era battlecruiser upgraded during the 1930s, suffered at least 4 torpedo strikes while desperately maneuvering to evade the attackers. Her anti-aircraft gunners managed to down several Japanese planes, but the relentless coordination of the torpedo runs proved impossible to stop. The accumulated damage was fatal. Both great ships capsized and slipped beneath the waves within hours. Prince of Wales sank around 13:20 hours, followed by Repulse roughly 13 minutes later. A total of 841 British sailors lost their lives. Survivors were pulled from the water by nearby destroyers. The entire engagement lasted under 2 hours from the first sighting to the final sinking. For the first time in history, major warships actively defending themselves had been destroyed entirely by air power on the open sea. The G4M Betty bomber had accomplished what naval theorists had debated for generations. British naval dominance in the Far East was obliterated in barely 90 minutes. Across the Pacific through early 1942, American and Allied pilots encountered Betty bombers in nearly every engagement. The aircraft appeared untouchable, striking targets from distances that defied existing concepts of range. They bombed Darwin, Australia, from airfields 1,500 miles away, demonstrating reach unmatched by any Allied aircraft. They raided Port Moresby from bases across New Guinea's rugged mountains, maintaining pressure on Allied forces throughout the southwest Pacific. They attacked Guadalcanal from Repulse, over 600 miles distant, projecting Japanese air power across immense ocean spaces. The Betty's extraordinary range granted Japan strategic mobility that confounded Allied planners. American fighters stationed at forward bases lacked the endurance to intercept Betty's departing from remote locations. Allied installations found themselves bombed by aircraft flying from bases well beyond their own strike radius. This imbalance in range and capability allowed Japan to strike freely, while Allied forces struggled to respond effectively. The edge endured throughout the first 6 months of the war. Betty bombers played roles in nearly every Japanese offensive from the Pacific to Southeast Asia. They bombed targets in the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. They supported naval operations throughout the theater and carried out reconnaissance flights exceeding any Allied aircraft's endurance. The Betty became a symbol of Japanese aerial reach and lethal efficiency. Yet that dominance existed only where Allied fighter opposition was minimal. When Betty formations could fly unchallenged, when they struck from high altitude beyond gun range, when they could release their payloads and withdraw before interception, their impact was devastating. These conditions defined operations during early 1942, when Allied air power was scattered and weak. But by mid-year, the balance began to shift. American fighter numbers increased. Wildcats were replaced by faster Hellcats and Corsairs. Training and tactics improved, and Betty crews started to experience alarming losses. The turning point came on August 8, 1942. 23 G4M bombers from the 4th Air Group launched from Rabaul to strike American positions on Guadalcanal. Over Savo Island, U.S. fighters intercepted the formation. In the battle that followed, 18 of the 23 Bettys were shot down. Roughly 120 airmen perished. The worst single loss of G4Ms during the campaign. Fighter pilots' reports told a consistent story. The Betty ignited with the slightest damage. 2 or 3 bullets anywhere along the fuselage or wings were enough to trigger catastrophic fires. The aircraft soon earned grim nicknames that spread rapidly throughout American squadrons. Flying Cigar, One-Shot Lighter, Flying Zippo. All nicknames referred to the Betty's horrifying tendency to erupt in flames after even minimal damage. By October 1942, when Lieutenant Commander John Thomas Blackburn arrived at Guadalcanal leading VF-17 and flying F-4U Corsairs, the bomber's reputation had completely changed. The first time we engaged a Betty formation, we couldn't believe how easily they went down. Blackburn later recalled, hit them anywhere along the fuselage or wings and they'd blow apart. His squadron began deliberately hunting them, recognizing the Betty as one of the most fragile targets in the Pacific skies. But the full extent of its vulnerability and the engineering choices that made such catastrophic losses inevitable wouldn't be completely understood until Allied forces began capturing intact examples for study. The first major intelligence breakthrough occurred in November 1942, when Australian troops overran Japanese airfields at Buna in Papua New Guinea. Among the abandoned aircraft, Allied technical air intelligence personnel found several Betty bombers in various states of damage. Initial inspections confirmed what combat pilots had long reported. The fuel tanks lacked any protection. Aeronautical engineers from the Southwest Pacific's Allied Technical Air Intelligence Unit conducted the first in-depth analysis. Opening the wing panels revealed fuel cells with no defense whatsoever. Thin aluminum skins, no rubberized sealant, no protective coating, no fire suppression systems. Every Betty examined at Buna displayed the same construction. This wasn't field damage or modification, it was standard Japanese engineering. The implications were staggering. By 1942, every American bomber already carried self-sealing fuel tanks. The B-17 Flying Fortress had used them since the C model, the B-24 Liberator since its early prototypes. Even fighters like the P-38 and P-47 employed protected systems. These tanks used layered rubber compounds that expanded on contact with leaking fuel, sealing punctures from bullets or shrapnel and preventing fires. The technology added weight, but drastically improved survivability. U.S. doctrine considered that trade-off vital and non-negotiable. Yet here was Japan's principal land-based bomber, produced in the thousands and operating throughout the Pacific, carrying fuel in completely unprotected tanks. The weight saved by omitting armor, sealant, and suppression gear was obvious. The price, measured in lost crews, was becoming painfully clear as casualty numbers mounted. The Betty captured intact at Clark Field in January 1945 would yield the most thorough technical assessment. Major McCoy and his team spent 3 weeks disassembling and cataloging every system. Their report, classified secret and circulated among all Allied air commands, described specifications explaining both the Betty's remarkable performance and its fatal weaknesses. The G4M Model 1's figures told the story of an aircraft built single-mindedly for range and speed, an empty weight of 6,741 kilograms, exceptionally light for its class, and a maximum takeoff weight of 9,500 kilograms. Fuel capacity totaled 4,780 liters across 8 unprotected tanks, 4 per wing, clustered near the wing roots where they were most exposed to gunfire. Top speed reached 428 kilometers per hour, roughly 265 miles per hour, with a maximum range of 6,034 kilometers, 3,700 miles, and a service ceiling of 8,500 meters. Crew complement: 7. Pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, and 2 gunners. The fuel system layout proved especially telling. The 8 tanks were paired in 4 groups along the wing's longitudinal axis, right where the wings joined the fuselage. This arrangement maximized capacity by using the thickest structural section of the wing, but it also placed the tanks squarely in the path of enemy fire. Any side or underside hit almost certainly struck fuel, and the thin aluminum construction offered no protection at all. The lack of self-sealing compounds meant that even minor punctures caused fuel to leak continuously. American engineers estimated that omitting protective systems saved more than 500 kilograms per aircraft. That reduction directly translated into extra fuel capacity and extended range, but the price in vulnerability was just as measurable. Combat data showed that any Betty struck in the wings almost certainly exploded. The exposed tanks created what engineers called a critical failure point, a single weak system whose destruction guaranteed the bomber's loss. These statistics reflected design choices first made in September 1937, when the Imperial Japanese Navy issued the specifications that would define the G4M's entire existence. A top speed of 398 kilometers per hour, a cruising altitude of 3,000 meters, an operational range of 4,722 kilometers empty, or 3,700 kilometers when carrying an 800-kilogram bomb or torpedo load. Those demands mirrored Japan's naval doctrine of the late 1930s. The empire stretched across vast Pacific distances, with island bases separated by thousands of kilometers. The Navy required bombers capable of striking targets far beyond carrier range, land-based aircraft that could support fleet operations across the entire Pacific basin. Existing designs could not meet that need. The G4M Nell, then in service, could reach only about 3,000 kilometers. Early American B-17s had even shorter range. No bomber anywhere in the world in 1937 could hit targets at the distances Japanese strategists envisioned. The Navy's goals were not arbitrary. They were derived from the actual geography of potential campaigns. Formosa to the Philippines, 460 miles. Rabaul to Guadalcanal, 600 miles. From Japan's home islands to targets scattered across the Pacific, thousands more. A bomber capable of such missions would give Japan a strategic reach unmatched by any other power. Yet those requirements also revealed assumptions about future warfare that would prove disastrously wrong. Planners believed surprise and aggressive initiative would protect their bombers. They assumed enemy fighters would be too few and too short-ranged to intercept. They expected the conflict to be decided quickly, before industrial powers could respond. Every one of those assumptions would collapse. The man tasked with achieving this impossible balance was Kiro Honjo, who succeeded Joji Hattori as Mitsubishi's chief designer. Honjo had studied bomber design at Germany's Junkers Company in the early 1930s, mastering European engineering techniques before returning to Japan. He recognized instantly that fulfilling the Navy's demands would require sacrifices no Western Air Force would ever consider acceptable. At Mitsubishi's Nagoya plant, Honjo gathered a team of engineers to confront the challenge. They dissected every facet of bomber design, calculating precise weight limits for each component. The team examined foreign aircraft, searching for any method to reduce mass without endangering structural integrity. They experimented with new materials and construction processes that might shave off critical kilograms. The arithmetic was merciless. To achieve the range required, the bomber would need enormous fuel capacity. Each liter of aviation fuel weighed roughly 0.8 kilograms, so 4,780 liters equaled about 3,800 kilograms when full. To reach the specified speed carrying that load, total weight had to be kept to an absolute minimum. Every added kilogram meant less range or less bomb load. The two goals stood in direct opposition. Fuel was heavy. Protection was heavy. Armor sufficient to shield vital areas would add hundreds of kilograms. Self-sealing tanks demanded layers of rubber and extra structure. Fire suppression systems added even more mass. Redundant safety measures compounded the problem. The total weight of proper protection would make the Navy's performance requirements physically impossible to achieve. Honjo made the decision that would define the G4M throughout its service life. Protection would be sacrificed for performance. The fuel tanks would be constructed from unprotected aluminum. No self-sealing layers, no armor plating around the cells, No fire suppression systems beyond handheld extinguishers. No redundant safety features at all. Every kilogram saved would go toward extra fuel, longer range, and meeting the Navy's exacting performance standards. The decision wasn't made lightly. Honjo fully understood the risks. His engineers calculated the vulnerabilities those bare tanks would introduce. They knew that any damage to the wings would likely result in total destruction. But they also knew that, with the technology available, there was no other way to meet the Navy's demands. The choice was stark: build a bomber that achieved range and speed at the cost of survivability, or build one that could endure combat but failed to fulfill the mission. The Navy demanded performance. Honjo delivered it. The first G4M prototype took flight on October 23, 1939, and met or exceeded every specification. Its speed surpassed expectations, its range outperformed projections, and its payload capacity satisfied operational requirements. The design entered mass production as the Navy Type 1 attack bomber, built by Mitsubishi at its Nagoya facilities. The initial production model, designated G4M Model 1, began reaching operational units in April 1941. By December of that year, roughly 180 aircraft were in service. These bombers became the core of Japan's land-based air power across the Pacific. Their combat debut at Clark Field and against Force Z validated Honjo's priorities, at least under the specific conditions of early 1942. When facing limited opposition, when surprise was achieved, when flying beyond the range of enemy fighters, the Betty proved devastatingly effective. Its immense range allowed attacks from bases thought untouchable. Its speed enabled fast strikes deep into enemy territory. Its bomb load delivered meaningful damage to ships and airfields alike. But those strengths depended entirely on the assumption that Betty formations would rarely face serious interception. Once American fighter presence increased, once dogfights became unavoidable, every design decision that had favored range over protection turned deadly for the crews. The Guadalcanal campaign revealed the flaw with brutal clarity. From August through October 1942, more than 100 G4M bombers were lost with nearly all their crews, in a campaign of attrition Japan could not endure. The mission on August 8th alone cost 18 of 23 aircraft and about 120 aviators. The same pattern repeated with merciless regularity. Betty squadrons flew from Rabaul, 600 miles to Guadalcanal, only to be intercepted and cut to pieces by American fighters. Losses on August 9th. More on August 10th. By the end of that month, the 4th Air Group had been wiped out as a fighting unit. September brought no relief. Betty raids continued, and U.S. defenses continued annihilating them. The arithmetic was inescapable. Japan needed to strike American forces to contest Guadalcanal. The Betty was the only bomber capable of delivering those attacks from Rabaul. But each mission bled the force dry. In October, the slaughter persisted. American air strength grew as new squadrons arrived at Henderson Field. Pilot skill improved with experience. Tactics evolved to exploit every known weakness of the Betty's design. Losses mounted even faster than replacements could arrive. By November, as Japan withdrew from Guadalcanal, over 100 Bettys had been lost and about 700 airmen killed. The exchange rate was catastrophic. Japan's most capable land-based bomber had been undone by its own design, transformed from a feared long-range weapon into what American pilots grimly called easy meat. Japanese strategists had anticipated losses. Operations always incur casualties, but the scale of the Betty's losses surpassed every estimate. The same unprotected fuel tanks that granted a 6,000-kilometer range also ensured that any hit to the wings or fuselage was almost always fatal. There was no middle ground, no crippled aircraft limping home, no damaged bombers surviving with wounded crews. Bettys either returned untouched or vanished in fire. By mid-1943, Japanese engineers understood that changes were unavoidable. Beginning with the 663rd aircraft completed in March 1943, 30mm rubber sheets were added beneath the wings, directly under the fuel tanks. These were not true self-sealing tanks, but a compromise, a minimal-weight solution offering only limited resistance to fuel leakage. The change cost 9 km per hour in top speed and cut maximum range by 315 kilometers, yet survival rates showed no measurable improvement. The rubber liners could slow leaks from small-caliber hits, but could not stop fires from cannon rounds or prevent explosions when tracer rounds ignited vapor. The Betty's core weakness remained untouched. Later efforts sought deeper fixes. The G4M Model 3, introduced in October 1944, incorporated genuine self-sealing tanks, reducing capacity to 4,490 liters to make room for the protective material. The improvement came at a cost. Range fell to 3,640 kilometers, more than 2,000 less than the original G4M Model 1. Barely 60 Model 3s were built before Japan's defeat. The change arrived too late, in too few numbers, to influence the bomber's legacy. By late 1944, American air supremacy was so complete that no level of protection could have made the Betty viable in combat. The war's outcome was already sealed. The aircraft's vulnerability had become infamous, and ironically, American forces soon used the Betty itself to illustrate the dangers faced by its crews. On April 18, 1943, a G4M carrying Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto became the setting for one of the most precise aerial interceptions of the war, and a dramatic testament to both Allied intelligence and the Betty's fatal flaws. U.S. codebreakers had intercepted messages revealing Yamamoto's travel plans from Rabaul to Bougainville. He would be aboard a Betty, escorted by fighters. 18 P-38. Lightnings of the 339th Fighter Squadron were assigned to intercept, though only 16 ultimately took off after mechanical issues grounded 2. The mission demanded absolute precision. A flight of over 400 miles at wave-top height to evade radar, crossing open ocean by dead reckoning, and arriving at a single point in space at an exact moment in time. A single navigational error would mean failure. At 0725 hours, the P-38s departed Guadalcanal, skimming just 50 feet above the sea in radio silence. After nearly 2 hours of flawless navigation, they reached the intercept point almost exactly on schedule, 1 minute early. At 0934 hours, the pilots sighted 2 Betty bombers flying low, escorted by 6 Zero fighters. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber dived to attack, while the others engaged the escort. Barber targeted the lead. Betty, Yamamoto's aircraft. His gunfire struck the wings, directly where the unprotected fuel tanks were located. Flames erupted instantly, and the bomber plunged into the jungle below. Yamamoto's body was recovered the following day. He had been killed in the crash. The second Betty also went down, with no survivors. The operation showcased every dimension of Allied superiority. U.S. intelligence had read and exploited Japanese signals. American planners had executed a 400-mile intercept with 1-minute accuracy. Yet beneath the triumph lay the same truth the Japanese engineers had faced years earlier. The Betty's extraordinary range had been purchased at the cost of its soul. American fighters executed the mission with flawless precision, despite immense navigational challenges, and the Betty's vulnerabilities ensured that Yamamoto's aircraft could never have survived once intercepted. The unprotected fuel tanks guaranteed that any hit would be catastrophic. That same vulnerability reached its most tragic and dramatic demonstration on March 21, 1945. 18 G4M bombers lifted off from Kanoya Air Base, each burdened with an MXY-7OK rocket-powered bomb slung beneath its fuselage. The Oka, named Cherry Blossom, was a piloted rocket-driven weapon carrying a 1,200-kilogram warhead designed for kamikaze strikes against American ships. The mission demanded that the Bettys carry their deadly payloads to within 20 kilometers of the target fleet before releasing them. Only then would the Oka pilot ignite the rocket motor and plunge toward an enemy vessel at over 650 kilometers per hour. In theory, the weapon could obliterate any ship it struck. In practice, the entire operation depended on the Bettys surviving long enough to reach release range, a near impossibility by 1945. The formation departed Kanoya around 14:30 hours, flying in close formation under escort toward the American fleet off Okinawa. Each bomber's external Oka load added immense drag and weight, crippling speed and maneuverability. The Bettys were now even more vulnerable than before, unable to evade or climb effectively under the strain. American radar picked them up at 100 miles out. F-6F Hellcats from USS Hornet were scrambled to intercept. They reached the formation long before it could approach release range. In the fierce engagement that followed, the Hellcats methodically destroyed every bomber. The Bettys, already defenseless under normal conditions, were helpless now, slow, overloaded, and burning with a single tracer hit. The extra weight prevented evasive maneuvers. The exposed fuel tanks ensured that every hit was fatal. One after another, the bombers burst into flames and plunged into the sea. Not a single aircraft reached its release point. Not one Oka was launched. All 18 bombers and their crews were lost. 137 airmen and 15 OK pilots killed. The mission stood as the ultimate expression of the Betty's fatal design compromise. Built for range, it could not survive to deliver its payloads against a prepared enemy. The extraordinary distances it could traverse meant nothing when no bomber lived long enough to strike. The final mission flown by any Betty came on August 19, 1945, 4 days after Emperor Hirohito's broadcast announcing Japan's surrender. 2 white-painted G4M bombers with large green crosses took off from Atsugi Airfield. Their call signs were Bataan 1 and Bataan 2. Aboard were Japanese representatives en route to negotiate surrender terms with Allied forces. The aircraft flew to Hiroshima, where the delegation would transfer to an American C-54 for transport to Manila. The symbolism was unmistakable. The white paint and green crosses marked them as emissaries of peace, transforming the once feared flying Zippo into a vehicle of surrender. The call signs themselves, Bataan 1 and Bataan 2, invoked a bitter memory. The 1942 fall of Bataan, when American forces had capitulated to Japan. 3 years later, aircraft bearing that name carried Japan's own delegation to submit in defeat. Lieutenant Densudo piloted one of the surrender planes, a G6M Model 1 transport variant converted from the bomber design. The aircraft retained the Betty's familiar sleek fuselage and long wings, but its bomb bays had been replaced with seats for passengers and diplomatic cargo. The crew wore dress uniforms rather than flight suits. There were no guns, no ammunition, no weapons of any kind. The flight from Atsugi to Hiroshima covered roughly 1,000 kilometers, well within the aircraft's range, even stripped of its wartime fuel load. American fighters escorted the white-painted Bettys the entire distance, ensuring they followed the prescribed course. The escort was both a protection and a silent watch, guaranteeing safety while symbolizing supervision over a defeated empire. As the 2 white bombers descended onto Hiroshima's runway, they carried more than a surrender delegation. They carried the closing image of an era. The same aircraft that had opened the Pacific War by destroying American air power at Clark Field now brought Japan's emissaries to end it. The circle was complete. The Mitsubishi G4M, once the symbol of Japan's reach and power, ended the war not in flame, but in silence, its final flight a gesture of peace from the machine that had once burned across the skies. Avoiding damage became the only form of protection available to Betty crews, a grim reality that defined their experience throughout the Pacific War. Veteran airmen understood that once American fighters appeared, survival was no longer a matter of skill or courage, but of luck and distance. Those who returned often did so only because their formations had not been intercepted. The Japanese Navy's doctrine compounded the danger. Bomber crews were trained and expected to maintain tight formations and press attacks regardless of opposition. This tactical rigidity, effective in 1941 and early 1942 when Allied defenses were scattered and weak, became suicidal once the Allies achieved air superiority. The Betty's range could no longer compensate for its fragility. Every mission became a potential death sentence. By late 1943, operational reports from frontline units painted a bleak picture. Squadron strength dropped sharply after every sortie. Replacement crews arrived with minimal training and faced combat conditions for which no preparation could suffice. The aircraft's design, once celebrated for elegance and efficiency, now doomed those who flew it. The G4M's very lightness, its defining characteristic, had become its executioner. The contrast with Allied bombers was striking. American and British designs emphasized protection and survivability. Armored cockpits, self-sealing tanks, and defensive gun turrets. Damaged aircraft often returned to base, allowing crews to fight again. The Betty offered none of these advantages. Its structural philosophy, shaped by range above all else, reflected a strategic outlook that assumed offense would always outweigh defense, a belief rendered obsolete as the war turned against Japan. In the end, the G4M stood as both a triumph of engineering and a tragedy of doctrine. Its extraordinary range and performance represented the peak of Japanese aeronautical design in the late 1930s. Yet those same qualities ensured catastrophic losses once Japan lost the initiative. The aircraft's operational history mirrored Japan's own wartime trajectory, brilliant early success followed by relentless attrition and final collapse. Only a handful of Betty bombers survived intact into peacetime. Most were scrapped immediately after the surrender. A few were used briefly by Allied occupation forces for transport and evaluation. Today, only fragments and partial airframes remain in museums and private collections. The surviving examples, corroded and incomplete, stand as silent witnesses to a generation of airmen who flew an aircraft that gave everything to range and nothing to survival. The Betty's legacy endures not in numbers or victories, but in lessons. It remains a stark reminder that technological achievement divorced from strategic reality offers no protection from consequence. The G4M was one of the most advanced bombers of its time, and one of the most vulnerable ever built. Its long, slender wings and gleaming aluminum skin carried both the ambitions of an empire and the inevitability of its downfall. When the white-painted surrender aircraft touched down in August 1945, the story of the Betty came full circle. The same machine that had once symbolized Japan's far-reaching power now embodied its defeat. In the annals of aviation, few aircraft illustrate so clearly how design philosophy can determine not only performance, but destiny. Once hit, Betty bombers rarely survived. Once on fire, they never survived. The crews understood these odds and flew anyway because military discipline and cultural values demanded that they accept the risks, regardless of consequences. Surviving Betty crews were unanimous in their assessment. The aircraft's unprotected fuel tanks made survival a matter of pure chance. No amount of skill, no tactical innovation, no courage could compensate for the fundamental vulnerability built into every G4M. Former Flight Petty Officer Masao Sato, who completed 28 combat missions before transfer to training duties, offered the most direct summary. The Betty was a magnificent aircraft that asked us to die for its range. We flew it because we were ordered to fly it. We died in it because that was what it was designed to make us do. The comparison with Allied bomber protection systems highlights the stark difference in design philosophy. The B-17 Flying Fortress featured armor plating protecting pilot and co-pilot seats, with steel plates ranging from 0.3 to 0.31 inches thick. Armored bulkheads protected crew positions throughout the fuselage. The bombardier position featured armored glass. Waist gunner positions included protective shields. Self-sealing fuel tanks were standard from the B-17C model onward, introduced in 1941. The B-25 Mitchell incorporated similar comprehensive protection. Pilot and co-pilot seats featured armor backing. Fuel tanks included self-sealing compounds from early production. The B-25's empty weight of approximately 9,100 kilograms reflected the substantial weight penalty of protection systems, roughly 2,000 kilograms heavier than the Betty, despite similar size and role. The weight penalty for Allied protection systems was substantial and accepted as necessary. American studies during the war demonstrated the effectiveness of crew protection measures with statistical precision. Body armor reduced thoracic wound fatalities from 36% to 8%, a reduction of more than 75% in deaths from chest wounds. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced fire-related casualties by similar margins. Aircraft equipped with protected fuel systems showed survival rates 3 to 4 times higher than unprotected aircraft when damaged in combat. Protected crew positions increased survival rates in damaged aircraft by providing shielding from shell fragments and small arms fire. Armored glass prevented pilot casualties from head-on attacks. Bulkheads compartmentalized the fuselage, preventing fire or damage in one section from spreading throughout the aircraft. The comprehensive approach to crew protection reflected American doctrine that trained crews represented assets more valuable than aircraft, which could be replaced more easily than experienced combat veterans. The weight cost for this protection exceeded 1,000 pounds in most American bombers, but American industrial capacity permitted this weight penalty without sacrificing production numbers. American factories produced over 12,000 B-17 bombers and nearly 10,000 B-24 Liberators during the war. The production capacity meant that American forces could field large numbers of protected bombers without compromising capability. Japanese doctrine reached different conclusions. The Betty's design reflected a calculation that range and striking power outweighed crew survival. This philosophy assumed that achieving surprise and maintaining initiative would provide sufficient protection. It assumed that enemy opposition would remain limited. It assumed that the war would be short and decisive. All these assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. By mid-1942, American fighter strength increased to levels that made Betty interception routine. By late 1942, American pilots had learned to exploit every Betty vulnerability. By 1943, Betty formations suffered such devastating losses that missions became suicide operations. By 1944, Betty bombers could barely operate in daylight against American opposition. The mathematics of the Betty's war were written in fire and loss. Every advantage that made the aircraft formidable in early 1942 became irrelevant once sustained combat began. Range meant nothing when bombers exploded before reaching targets. Speed meant nothing when fighters could intercept from distant bases. Payload meant nothing when formations were destroyed before weapon release. The examination of tail number 763-12 at Clark Field in January 1945 revealed the complete story. The unprotected fuel tanks that shocked Major McCoy were not an oversight, not a temporary expedient, not a design failure. They were the deliberate choice of engineers who believed range mattered more than survival. Japanese designers had created exactly what their specifications demanded: an aircraft with extraordinary range and speed, built with minimal weight, optimized for the mission requirements they received. The tanks were unprotected because protection would have prevented achieving the required performance. The decision made perfect sense within the constraints of 1937 technology and 1937 assumptions about future warfare. But those assumptions collapsed under the reality of sustained combat against an opponent with unlimited industrial capacity and growing technological advantage. The Betty bomber became a symbol of Japanese willingness to accept catastrophic casualties in pursuit of tactical advantage. It became evidence of a military culture that valued mission accomplishment over crew survival. When American engineers examined the intact Betty at Clark Field, they were not just analyzing an enemy aircraft. They were witnessing the physical manifestation of choices made years earlier, choices that prioritized capability over survival, choices that would cost thousands of Japanese aircrew their lives. The unprotected fuel tanks were not an accident. They were a decision. The Betty bomber served from the first day of the Pacific War to the last. It sank capital ships and devastated air bases. It ranged across distances no other bomber could match, but its ultimate legacy is written in loss statistics that exceeded all projections. The aircraft that opened the war by destroying American air power at Clark Field ended the war carrying Japan's surrender delegation in white-painted aircraft, marked with green crosses. The crew of tail number 763-12 had abandoned their aircraft during the American advance on Clark Field. They had survived by walking away from an aircraft whose design made survival in combat nearly impossible. Most Betty crews were not so fortunate. They flew missions knowing the danger. They climbed into unprotected bombers and crossed vast Pacific distances. And they died in overwhelming numbers, consumed by fires that the aircraft's design made inevitable. The Betty bomber's story is ultimately about the price of capability without protection. It demonstrates that performance alone cannot guarantee success when that performance is purchased at the cost of crew survival. The extraordinary range of 6,000 kilometers meant nothing when aircraft could not survive the final 100 kilometers to target. The impressive speed of 428 kilometers per hour provided no advantage when American fighters could intercept from distant bases with warning from radar systems. The payload capacity of 1 ton became irrelevant when formations were destroyed before weapon release. Most importantly, the Betty reveals that military technology divorced from realistic assessment of combat conditions produces weapons that kill their own crews as efficiently as they strike enemy targets. The assumptions underlying the Betty's design, assumptions about limited opposition and short warfare duration, proved catastrophically wrong within months of the Pacific War's start. By the time these assumptions were proven false, thousands of Betty bombers were already in service or production, and the Japanese industry lacked the capacity to replace them with better protected designs. Japanese designers understood the risks when they made their choices in 1937 and 1938. They calculated the weight penalties. They knew the vulnerabilities. They accepted the trade-offs because they believed the performance advantages would prove decisive. They were wrong, and thousands of men paid the price for that miscalculation with their lives. The Betty's legacy extends beyond aviation history into fundamental questions about aircraft design, philosophy, military ethics, acceptable risk, and the value of human life in warfare. American designers answered those questions by prioritizing protection even at the cost of performance. Japanese designers answered differently. It stands as evidence of what happens when capability is prioritized over survivability, when range is purchased with crew lives, when performance requirements override protection considerations. The thousands of burning Betty bombers across the Pacific sky marked the consequences of that philosophical difference, revealing the fundamental divide between how nations approached warfare in the Pacific. American forces designed aircraft to bring crews home. Japanese forces designed aircraft to reach targets regardless of cost. In the end, the nation that valued crew survival built an air force that could sustain operations indefinitely. The nation that accepted catastrophic casualties for performance advantages built an air force that destroyed itself through attrition. The examination of tail number 763-12 at Clark Field provided the final proof of what Allied forces had suspected for years. The Betty bomber was not poorly designed. It was brilliantly designed to achieve specific goals. Those goals simply did not include bringing Japanese crews home alive. And in that single fact lies the entire story of why Japan lost the Pacific War.